Today, we're learning the history of Chinese restaurants in small town Saskatchewan. We're also paying tribute to these community hubs, places where many meals have been shared, where people come together over coffee and friendship. We also want to hear from you. Do you have fond memories of growing up in a Chinese restaurant or visiting one in your community? Maybe there's a place that is a big part of your life now, and perhaps you have a favorite dish. You can call us and tell us all about it, 1-800-716-2221, or email bluesky@cbc.ca. Joyce in Redvers writes, "My son was a good friend of the children from the Chinese restaurant. He was not the most popular kid in school, and neither were the Chinese children. Fast forward many years when my son was doing his ER residency in Calgary, he was dealing with a poison case and called Alberta Poison Control. He said, 'This is Dr. Ron George,' and the pharmacist on the line said, 'And this is Julie Ewan from Redvers.' Thought this was a good news story. Love CBC and your programs." Well, we love getting your emails, so send them along, bluesky@cbc.ca. Now, these iconic Chinese restaurants in small towns aren't unique to Saskatchewan. They're not unique to Canada. In fact, it's something that our next guest today has explored all over the globe. Chuck Kwan is a filmmaker and author. He has a TV show available on YouTube, Chuck Kwan's Chinese Restaurants. And he's also the author of Have You Eaten Yet? Stories from Chinese restaurants around the world. He says Chinese restaurants are a microcosm of greater social forces, an insight into time, history, and place. And even though his storytelling has taken him all over the world, it's interesting that his book starts right here in Saskatchewan. So Chuck Kwan, welcome to Blue Sky.
Good afternoon, Jenna.
I'm Leisha, but it's great to have you here, Chuck. Jenna
Oh,
is working the phones in the background, and
I'm
so
sorry.
don't worry. Chuck, it's great to have you. You were the topic of conversation at the bus stop when I was picking up my daughter. There were people there who were familiar with your book, so it's a pleasure to have you. And
Oh, thank you.
yeah, and it's so cool that your book starts talking about a restaurant in Saskatchewan. So tell us a bit about that restaurant.
Well, it's a small town in Outlook, Saskatchewan. I would imagine now today might be 2 or 3 thousand people. And it's one main street, no stop signs, no lights, and it's just amazing. That when I first got there, it was that whole Chinese cafe in small town Saskatchewan feeling that I've always heard of so much about. So my character is Noisy Jim. He ran a new Outlook cafe, which he kind of started back in the early 50s. And he's been running that cafe since until he died, basically about maybe 20 years ago after I filmed him. So it's a wonderful story. And what Vanessa and Anne have talked about are exactly his story, from the being a social community center, to people asking him to run for mayor of the town, to when his funeral, the whole town showed up at the hockey arena, and his pallbearers were kind of the hockey team that he sponsored. So that tells you all you need to know about the kind of person he is.
Yeah, no kidding. No kidding. So when you first met him, I think it was about 25 years ago, what do you remember most about that first encounter with him?
He was very gregarious, and he was very outspoken, and he speaks with a horsey voice, and sounds like somebody out of the movie. And I find it very unusual, especially for a Chinese immigrant to be so loud. And that's why his nickname is called Noisy, because that's what his customers call him, Noisy. And his first name, of course, Jim. So he's known as Noisy Jim. And so I first met him in 1997 when I was on a photography trip through the prairies, going through all the small town cafes in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And I decided that, hey, he's the one I want to be on my film. So I made a point of going back to his place 3 years later, and still find him there. But by that time, he has retired. What he did was very familiar, as Anne has talked about, is that he got a couple from his village, home village, not related, but certainly from his home village that came in and sort of took over the restaurant, and he retired. But the important thing about that is that even though had retired for like 6, 7 years, he still continues to pour coffee for his customers, and we have a whole generation of customers that have grown up in the cafe. Grandfather, mother, and daughter. So, and people tell me that, oh, my grandfather used to come here, and they used to bring my father there, and also, so that it really is a prairie institution that we know so much about.
What an incredible story. I'm sure people listening have their own memories of Noisy Jim, or perhaps it reminds you of a story from your own community that you'd like to share with us. We'd love to hear from you. You should call now. Don't all wait till the end. We'd like to hear your stories. So give us a shout, 1-800-716-2221, or email bluesky@cbc.ca. Chuck, I'm so interested in the fact that you've spent time in Saskatchewan, like you said, Alberta, but you've traveled the globe kind of exploring these restaurants. And I think we feel here in this province like this is so unique to us. And as we learned from Anne, and also as Vanessa's learning, this is right across the country, but you've gone around the globe. I find that really interesting. Are there similarities beyond sort of Canadian borders that you want to share with us?
Very similar when it comes to family-run restaurants, small restaurants uh, that were perhaps started by an immigrant family, or maybe a third-generation Peruvian. So, uh, what I wanted to do, I spent 4 years traveling the globe from the Amazon to the Arctic Circle to look for Chinese restaurants that I want to put in my film. And Noisy Jim happens to be the obviously first restaurant, first stop of my 4 year journey. And from there, I went to Peru, I went to Mauritius, Argentina, Israel, and of course, Norway. So, in that sense, I have done a little bit of a sampling of the kind of global Chinese restaurant phenomena.
Hmm. Okay, so I want to know about, you've tasted food at all of these places. And I do want to ask you about authenticity, because Anne alluded to how some people consider the Canadian American version of Chinese food in some of these cafes is not, quote, authentic. And so I'm curious, the range of food that you tasted, and what do you think menus tell us about how Chinese people adapt to life in a new country, whether that's Canada or Peru or Israel?
To answer your first question, your second question was that that's one of the things I found in all over the world is the adaptability and the resilience of Chinese immigrants into these different countries where they don't speak the language or don't know the culture. And then, of course, I used to be a kind of so-called real Chinese, as in I only want my authentic Chinese food. And then, of course, my concept of that has been broken in a sense that, and people keep asking me what's authentic, and I finally have to come up with the answer. Say, look, there's nothing as an authentic Chinese cuisine. My association with authenticity is about food and memory. Basically, it's what your grandparents, what your mother cooked for you. We have the whole stereotype of the nonna from the Italian, immigrant family, where you learn your pasta recipe from your grandmother. We have the same thing here in our culture, and then of course, whatever you grow up with is what basically find authentic. I grew up in Singapore, where they serve obviously a very different brand of Chinese food. And of course, I find that very authentic because that to me is my Chinese food compared to other places. And of course, coming back to Canada, I would agree with Anne. I mean, it's almond chicken and sweet and sour pork and chop suey are as authentic Chinese Canadian as it can be.
Because do you wonder, sometimes people think, well, are you serving this because you think the people in Outlook want it, or is it just that things aren't static? Like, I hear what you're saying. I mean,
Right.
I grew up Polish. I had a nana, and she made pierogies the way I like them, right? Like, her recipe is the best. So I totally hear what you're saying. But I do wonder, are people who take on these restaurants, are they trying to serve a local clientele, or do recipes just evolve over time? Like, what do you think about that?
No, I mean, this is all about survival. You have to adapt. Like any business, you have to adapt to your customers' taste and marketing. So when your market is only for sweet and sour pork, then you do it, whether you like it or not, because that's the way to survive. And that's what I find in all restaurants around the world. Uh, we have a brand of what we call chifa, which is Chinese Peruvian cuisine, which has evolved into a kind of a authentic Peruvian cuisine, but it's Chinese influence. So, in a sense that over the century, uh, food, the idea of authentic food has evolved. To this day, we're talking about fusion,
Hmm.
and that's because people want to adopt to the whole kind of a new younger people taste of, hey, combining French and Chinese. It's that kind of thing that I think we're talking about. And I think the Chinese owners, restaurant owners, are adapting very well because for no other reason they need to make some money.
It's fascinating, Chuck. I'd love for people to give us a shout today, 1-800-716-2221. Our email address is bluesky@cbc.ca. We'd love to hear about the Chinese restaurant in your community, some of the dishes that you've had, and perhaps you're like Vanessa and you grew up in one. We'd love to hear from you today. So again, 1-800-716-2221, email bluesky@cbc.ca. So, Chuck, in your travels around Saskatchewan, Alberta, what are some of your favorite dishes? What is your favorite dish that you've eaten in one of these small town restaurants?
I would say almond chicken. Like Anne, I never heard of it before, but I took a liking to it. So, so in that sense, I'm a converted Chinese Canadian food,
I want to ask you about the title of your book. Have you eaten yet? Why
right?
did you choose that title?
Well, have you eaten yet? It's a colloquial expression, especially by the Cantonese, who were mostly the majority of immigrants into China, into Canada. Because China was such a poor country at that time, 100 years ago, and people didn't have enough to eat because of famine, revolution, and whatnot. Uh, Surviving and keeping your stomach full is a very daily existential question. So when people greet each other, even in the old Chinatowns in across Canada, they would ask each other, "Have you eaten yet?" Meaning, it. How are you? But basically, it's a concern. How are you doing? Are you okay? Are you fed? Are you that kind of thing. So that has become kind of a "How are you" expression among a lot of older Chinese people. So, and that's to me is a very symptomatic of what Chinese food is too, a culture that puts so much emphasis on food.
And that spirit of like making sure other people are taken care of. Have you eaten yet? That sounds like something noisy Jim would have said. Is that common? That sense of taking care of one another in some of the
Yes,
restaurants that you
yes.
visited? Yeah.
I find that one of the traits. I mean, I hate to be cliche, but Chinese do take care of the families, especially the younger generation. And the reason why Noisy Jim sacrificed so much for his life is that he wants his 7 kids to have a better education than he does, and to be a doctor in Calgary or a lawyer in Saskatoon. So it's that kind of thinking about the future generation and thinking about your family that is very, I say, very typical of a Chinese philosophy in life. So in that sense, I think it's very, very appropriate.
Yeah, I was quite moved when Vanessa talked about just not being able to imagine doing that, right? And how
Right.
that's kind of the point. Like her life is so different, and she talked about having all these resources, and she's got so much, and she can't imagine having the resiliency to move to a small town and not know the language and do it, and how Anne kind of frame that, like it's kind of the point, is to
Yeah.
pave the way for others. Something else that Anne brought up that I want to talk to you about, she was really thinking about how we refer to these Chinese restaurants, and had talked to others about how she didn't really like referring to Chinese restaurants as cultural outposts. Let's take a listen.
When I was setting out on this journey, when I was first starting my research on this book, I had a conversation with Henry Yu, who's a professor of history at the University of British Columbia, and he studies this stuff. He studies the Chinese Canadian experience in Canada and writes about it quite a bit. And I remember him warning me over and over again in saying, do not call these restaurants cultural outposts. That's something that you hear often when people are writing about the Chinese restaurant experience. They call these places cultural outposts, that these places are a place where people share their cultures, and that there is this kind of exchange of ideas and knowledge and some kind of a shared understanding. And he really wanted to drive home for me the point that these restaurants are not places of equal exchange necessarily. A relationship where a restaurant owner is meeting a customer and someone on whom they rely on for their livelihood, that is not an equal exchange.
That's Anne Huey, and our guest today is Chuck Kwan. Chuck, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I think Henry is exactly right. One of the problems that Chinese restaurants face, or the Chinese community face, is we're always thinking of as the other, the exotic, minority, ethnic minority in Canada. But with this whole multicultural Canada that we're in right now, we're no different from the Italians, from the Portuguese, and the Poles, and so forth. So, in that sense, I think it's one of the things that I wanted to do in my book, as well as my movie, is that I want to normalize that whole Chinese restaurant experience. It's not the other thing, in the exotic Chinatown that we go to. It's your normal community life, as in Noisy Jim. I mean, people in Outlook treat Noisy Jim as just another restaurant, but it's also a community center where I can drop in after a movie when it's the only place that's open. Or when I'm a farmer, I would come for my first coffee at 6 a.m. Because that's the only place open in that small town. So I think we need to normalize that kind of concept of the exotic Chinese restaurant.
We've got a couple of callers on the line, so let's welcome Louise in Regina to Blue Sky. Hi, Louise.
Good afternoon. I'm late coming into your program, so I apologize if I'm repeating some things that have already been on. But my uncle worked for the CPR Railroad, and his father did, and his grandfather did. And the story that was passed down through CPR employees was that in 1885, when the railway was completed in British Columbia, there was a lot of Chinese railway workers who were unemployed, and the city of Vancouver and some of the communities were afraid of Chinatown. They didn't want it expanding more, so they kind of lied to the employees and told them, we'll give you a free train ride across the Rockies to the prairies, and there's these huge, wonderful opportunities. So people got on the train. They were given a free ride once they got across the mountains, where the train stopped at a water tower because they were steam engines that had to fill up with water. Somebody, one person or one family, was unceremoniously dumped off the train in these small communities. And so people had to make a living. And that's why so many of these small towns have a really old Chinese restaurant. And to make matters worse, municipalities passed laws that it was illegal to hire a white woman to work in a Chinese restaurant. And so a lot of the restaurateurs could only hire their own family because they weren't allowed to hire white women.
Yeah.
So that's the story that was passed down in my family through CPR rail employees.
Yeah, Louise, thank you for sharing that. It is it's uncomfortable to listen to and so important. And I think that's part of what Anne, was trying to accomplish with her book and providing that context. Like we need to know how this came to be. And so I appreciate you adding to the conversation, Louise. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. We've got David in Lumsden on the line. Hi, David.
Hi, Alicia. How are you doing?
I'm well, thanks. What's on your mind?
Thought I would just mention something that maybe people who've been to a lot of Chinese restaurants have encountered, but those who've only been to the one or two in their small town haven't encountered, and that's actually the variation that you see in different kinds of Chinese cooking. And I've had the experience of many people saying, well, I went to that restaurant. It was nothing like what I've had before, so I don't think it's real. And the variety is not only interesting to see just for experience, but people are often surprised to find out that the Chinese themselves are quite proud or scathing about other people's Chinese cooking. I've been in a situation where the food was so spicy, most people could barely handle eating a little. Asked the people there what they thought of cooking in another place, like Shanghai. They say, oh, those people don't know how to cook this. Their food is terrible. And the same thing happens here, that you say, oh, I had the food in Outlook, and it's nothing like in Lumsden. And it's actually all part of the wide variety that's available.
Yeah. David, thanks for calling. I appreciate it.
Thanks for your show. Have a great day.
You too. It's David joining us from Lumsden. Our guest today is Chuck Kwan, the author of Have You Eaten Yet? Stories from Chinese Restaurants Around the World. Chuck, time for just one or two more questions for you, because you did visit all these Chinese restaurants around the world, and I'm wondering how they may have helped you make sense of your own life as and I'm going to quote you here, a card-carrying member of the Chinese diaspora. How did these restaurants, Chuck, help you make sense of your own life? I think we actually have a frozen...
I'm sorry, I lost your...
There we go. Now you're there. I hope that wasn't too tough of a question, Chuck. Let me rephrase it for you, because I think we did freeze there for a second.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so just curious about how traveling and visiting all these Chinese restaurants really helped you with your own sense of identity and who you are as a, quote, card-carrying member of the Chinese diaspora.
Well, I came from that background, and I certainly reinforced my kind of global citizen concept. I think we are all one global citizen. We're talking about Chinese immigrants 100 years ago come to CPR. We're now talking about Syrian refugees. We're now talking about Afghan refugees. They're no different. It's just another generation, another century afterwards. And we certainly need to be able to cognizant of the fact that we're in a country of immigrants. And we need to open our arms and welcome people from different lands. Certainly, Chinese will welcome, or at least try to get a job here 100 years ago. And I think that we need to look further than our own little town and our own little province to think that, hey, there's a global world out there. And Chinese restaurants, in a sense, is one of the icons of globalization.
Chuck, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show today. I've learned so much, and I just really appreciate you being with us today. So thank you.
Thank you.
That is Chuck Kwan, a Canadian filmmaker, director, writer, storyteller, and activist. His book is called Have You Eaten Yet? Stories from Chinese Restaurants Around the World. He also has a show chronicling Chinese restaurants around the world, and it is available on YouTube.